in 1777 at Valley Forge in Pennsylvania. About 12,000 soldiers of the Continental Army stumbled into winter with too little food, too little clothing, and almost no certainty that the American Revolution would survive until spring. Snow crusted over the roads, wagons broke down before they reached camp, horses died by the hundreds, men wrapped rags around bleeding feet and left red marks behind them in the frozen mud. By February, roughly 2,000 soldiers were too sick to serve, and several thousand more were listed as unfit for duty. The army did not simply lack bullets, coats, or tents. It lacked bread, not elegant bread, not white wheat loaves baked in tidy brick ovens and placed on polished tables. Bread that could be mixed in a hurry, cooked on a hoe blade, baked against hot ashes, carried in a pouch, eaten beside a fire, and stretched when flour failed. Cornbread, a food you can buy today for a few dollars in a supermarket mix, or get beside chili at a roadside diner, once sat close to the center of survival in early America. That sounds strange at first. It is soft, yellow, crumbly, ordinary. It is the kind of thing people argue about at Thanksgiving, usually over sugar, skillet crust, or whether someone's grandmother made it correctly. But in early America, this was not a side dish. It was insurance, it was calories, it was storage, it was the difference between a household that could endure a hard season and one that could not. So how did a humble bread made from ground corn go from indigenous survival technology and wartime necessity to a familiar square on a modern dinner plate? How did it feed settlers, armies, enslaved people, frontier families, and entire regions before becoming something so ordinary that people forget it was ever remarkable? That was 1777. But the story of cornbread begins thousands of years before any European soldier shivered in Pennsylvania, before Jamestown, before Plymouth, before the United States had a name. It begins about 9,000 years ago, in what is now southern Mexico, with a wild grass that looks so unimpressive you might walk past it without bending down. Teosint. Pay attention to this next detail, because it explains almost everything. The ancestor of corn did not look like corn. It did not have fat yellow ears wrapped in green husks. It did not offer neat rows of kernels. It did not look like something you would butter, boil, roast, grind, or photograph at a county fair. Teosinte was a branching grass with small hard seed cases, each one locked inside a tough shell. The edible portion was tiny. The effort required was enormous. To a modern grocery shopper, it would not look like food at all. It would look like a weed with confidence. And yet, someone noticed. Not one person. Probably not one brilliant inventor standing in a field and announcing the future of American bread. History rarely works that cleanly, more likely. Generations of indigenous people in the Balsas River region of southwestern Mexico gathered these wild seeds, tested them, roasted them, cracked them, watched them, planted the better ones, and remembered which plants gave more food. They did not know the word genetics. They were doing it anyway. This was not simple farming. It was slow biological negotiation. Imagine standing there at the edge of a warm valley, long before metal tools, long before written records, long before any empire rose in Mesoamerica. The air is heavy with green smells after rain. Insects hum in the grass. Smoke from a small cooking fire drifts low against the earth. Someone kneels with a stone in one hand, cracking tiny seed cases open, separating what can be eaten from what will break the teeth. Another person watches which stalks grow strongest near the settlement, which seeds fall easily, which plants cluster in useful ways. A child learns by looking, touching, repeating. No textbook, no laboratory, no university. Observation, patience, hunger. Hunger is a strict teacher, Here is the part that does not get enough credit. Early maize was not discovered in its finished form. It had to be made, not manufactured in a factory, not invented in a single season, but shaped across lifetimes. People selected plants whose seeds were a little larger, whose stalks were a little more useful, whose food came free a little more easily. Some plants changed, some failed, some were saved, some were planted again. Think about that for a second. A wild grass became one of the most important crops in human history because people kept choosing, season after season, kernel after kernel, stalk after stalk. This was not luck. It was agriculture as memory. By roughly 7,000 years ago, maize was becoming more recognizable as a cultivated plant. By around 5,000 years ago, it had spread farther through Mesoamerica, moving with people, trade, marriage, migration, ritual, and necessity. It did not travel as an idea alone. It traveled in baskets, in hands, in stories, in seed bundles wrapped carefully because the next season depended on them. In a world without refrigeration, without canned goods, without supermarkets, without global shipping, a storable grain was not convenience. It was survival stakes technology. Fresh food could vanish, game could move away, fruit could rot, fish runs could fail, but dried maize could wait. It could sit through lean months. It could be ground when needed. It could become porridge, dough, cakes, thick drinks, and eventually the many ancestors of what English speakers would later call cornbread. The word corn itself needs a pause, because English has made this story more confusing than it has to be in older British usage. Corn simply meant the main grain of a region. In England, corn might mean wheat. In Scotland, it might mean oats. In parts of Europe, it could mean rye or barley. When English colonists came to North America, they encountered maize and began calling it Indian corn, meaning the local grain of indigenous people. Over time, in American English, corn came to mean maize almost exclusively, a tiny language shift, but an important one. The word narrowed as the crop took over. And it did take over. Not immediately, not evenly, not without resistance, but maize had qualities that wheat struggled to match in many parts of the Americas. It grew in diverse climates. It produced heavily. It could be dried and stored. It could be planted with beans and squash in systems that replenish soil and balance diets. It could be eaten fresh, dried, boiled, roasted, popped, fermented, or ground. It was food, seed, symbol, tax, offering, and calendar. It was not just a crop. It was a way of organizing time. Planting marked one season. Green corn marked another. Harvest meant labor, celebration, storage, and fear easing for a little while. You can picture the rhythm. Hands breaking ears from stalks, husks pulled back, kernels drying in the sun, stone tools grinding grain into meal, the soft scrape of work repeated so often it becomes background music to a civilization. Before cornbread had a name in English, before colonial cooks poured batter into iron skillets, before southern tables turned it into identity, maize was already teaching people how to live by seasons. This is where the bread begins, though it is not yet cornbread in the modern sense. It is ground grain and water. It is meal made from maize. It is cakes cooked on hot stones. It is dough pressed by hand. It is ash, clay, fire, steam, leaf wrapping, stone grinding, and the patient transformation of something hard into something the body can use. No yeast, no white flour, no bakery window, just grain, fire, and human attention. Now, many origin stories later grew around maize, especially in Mesoamerican traditions where maize was not merely useful but sacred. In the Maya creation story recorded in the Popol Vuh, human beings are formed from maize dough after earlier attempts at creation fail. Now, That story is not a farming manual, and it is not a literal archaeological record, but the fact that people imagined humanity itself as maize tells you something profound. This crop was not beside life. It was inside life. It was body, ancestry, and dependence all at once. You have to understand that before you can understand cornbread, because when early Europeans later encountered maize breads in the Americas, they often saw only rough food, coarse food, survival food, food for people they intended to conquer, convert, trade with, displace, or exploit. They missed the thousands of years underneath it. They missed the selection, the processing, the soil knowledge, the cooking technology, the seasonal intelligence. They saw yellow meal and thought it was simple. It was not simple. A piece of cornbread carries that older story quietly. It carries the wild grass in Mexico. It carries the hands that selected larger kernels. It carries the stone grinders, the cooking fires, the sacred stories, the stored baskets, the hungry winters, and the long movement of maize across the Americas. By the time it helped keep early America alive, it had already been keeping people alive for millennia, and the first great civilizations built around it were only beginning. You're still in southern Mexico, long before the word America exists, long before anyone in Europe knows this plant is growing under a hot sky on the other side of the ocean. The morning begins with mist lifting from valleys and ridges, with birds calling from brush, with the smell of damp earth rising after rain. There are no ploughed fields in the later sense, no straight rows running toward a horizon, no barns, no fences, no iron blades turning the soil. There are people watching plants. That sounds modest. It was not. The transformation of teosinte into maize is one of the most astonishing acts of domestication in human history, because the starting material was so unlikely. Teosinte did not offer itself generously. Its seeds were few, hard, and wrapped in protective cases. You could not simply peel back a husk and find abundance. You had to work for every bit of food. You had to crack, grind, roast, and experiment. You had to decide whether the effort was worth repeating. Somebody decided it was not once, again and again. Here is the detail that makes this strange. Early cultivators were not choosing from fields of perfect corn. They were choosing from variations so small that a careless person might not notice it at all. One plant had slightly softer seed cases. One plant held its seeds in a more useful cluster. One stalk seemed easier to harvest. One generation saved seeds from plants that fed the group a little better. The next generation did the same, and the next, and the next. A small choice, then another small choice, then another. Think about that for a second. If you hold a modern ear of corn in your hand, heavy, full, almost theatrical in its abundance, you are holding the result of countless decisions made by people whose names are gone. They left no signed documents. They built no stone monument saying, "We change this grass," but they did, patiently, repeatedly, scientifically, though not in the modern laboratory sense. They didn't know genes. They knew results. They knew which plants filled the basket. They knew which kernels stored better. They knew which seeds sprouted when the rains came. They knew which foods kept children from crying in the hungry part of the year. In that world, knowledge was not abstract. It had weight. It had taste. It had consequences. This was not agriculture as romance. This was agriculture as pressure. Imagine a family group near a seasonal camp. The rains have been unpredictable. Game trails have shifted. Gathered foods are less reliable than they were the year before. Someone brings in seed heads from teosinte and related grasses. The outer cases are hard against the fingers. The work is annoying, repetitive, almost insulting. A stone strikes seed after seed. Some crack cleanly, some scatter, some are too small to bother with. Smoke stings the eyes. Children hover nearby because children always hover near food, even difficult food. Then someone notices a plant worth remembering. Maybe its seeds are larger, maybe they cling differently, maybe the stalk branches in a way that makes gathering easier, maybe the taste is better after roasting. Now, historians and archaeologists cannot reconstruct that exact moment. And any tidy story about a single discoverer would almost certainly be a myth. But the broader process is clear. People noticed, people selected, people planted, people changed the plant, and the plant changed them back. That last part matters. Once a group begins depending on a cultivated plant, the calendar starts to tighten. You cannot wander quite as freely if seeds need tending. You cannot ignore the timing of rain if your future food is in the ground. You begin returning to certain places, you protect certain patches, you remember soil, shade, slope, insects, birds, and seasons. You learn what grows after fire, what grows after clearing, what grows near streams, what fails in dry ground. The plant asks something from you. Maize did not simply feed early farmers, it trained them into new rhythms, planting, weeding, watching, harvesting, drying, storing, grinding, eating, saving seed, beginning again. The year itself became a kind of story, and maize sat near the center of the plot. Slowly, the plant changed physically. The hard casing around the seed became less dominant. The edible kernels became larger. The arrangement of kernels became more compact. The cob, that central structure so familiar today that you barely think about it, became more important. Wild teosinte scattered its seeds naturally, which is excellent for a wild plant and inconvenient for a hungry human being. Domesticated maize became increasingly dependent on human hands. It no longer lived the same wild life. It needed people to remove the kernels, save the seeds, and plant them again. That is the bargain of domestication. The crop becomes more useful to humans. The humans become more responsible for the crop. Neither side is exactly independent afterward. By around 7,000 years ago, maize was moving beyond its earliest heartlands. By around 5,000 years ago, it had become a crop of major significance across parts of Mesoamerica. The spread was not a straight line on a map. It was not a single caravan carrying a miracle seed from village to village. It moved through exchange, migration, intermarriage, imitation, curiosity, and hunger. It crossed landscapes slowly, because people carried seeds only when seeds mattered enough to protect. And these seeds mattered. You can imagine them wrapped in fibre, tucked inside containers, carried through forest paths, over ridges, along rivers, between settlements. Not gold, not silver, not jewels. Seed. Small enough to fit in a hand, powerful enough to change a diet, in a world where one bad season could expose the fragility of everything. A productive grain was a form of wealth, not money and coins, money and calories. This is the point where maize begins to separate itself from ordinary wild food. It becomes reliable enough to plan around. Not perfectly reliable, because no crop is safe from drought, pests, flood, or human conflict, but reliable enough to store, reliable enough to support larger communities, reliable enough to become attached to ritual, authority, and identity. And here is where cornbread waits in the distance. Because bread is not only a recipe, bread is a relationship between grain and society. Wheat breads in Europe would later depend on fields, mills, ovens, yeast, property systems, rents, taxes, and markets. Maize breads in the Americas grew from different foundations. They came from stone grinding, fire cooking, leaf wrapping, ash treatment, communal labour, and indigenous understandings of nutrition that Europeans often failed to understand. Before there could be colonial cornbread, there had to be maize meal. Before maize meal, there had to be maize. Before maize, there had to be teosinte. And before teosinte became maize, There had to be people willing to look closely at an unpromising grass and see possibility. That is easy to miss now. Today, corn can feel almost invisible because it is everywhere. It sweetens drinks, it feeds animals, it becomes starch, syrup, oil, cereal, fuel, packaging, and snack food. It hides in supermarket aisles under names that do not sound like plants at all. But at the beginning, there was no industrial corn empire, no vast fields, no combines, no commodity futures, no yellow mountains of grain moving through global markets. There was a hand selecting seeds, there was a stone grinding grain, there was fire, and there was the slow realization that this stubborn grass could become a food people might build their lives around. By the time maize becomes more than a useful crop, by the time it begins to sit at the center of villages, ceremonies, trade, and power, you're no longer looking at a simple story of food. You're looking at civilization learning to speak through grain. Move forward through the centuries and the landscape changes. Settlements grow larger, fields become more deliberate, paths between communities become more worn, storage spaces matter more. So do calendars, rituals, leaders, obligations, and gods. The plant that began as a stubborn grass in southern Mexico now appears in places where people do not merely eat it, they explain the world with it. In parts of Mesoamerica, maize becomes a sacred substance, not a symbol in the weak modern sense, like a logo printed on a package, sacred in the deeper sense, body, ancestry, obligation, offering, and survival all folded into one plant. The Maya creation story known from the Popol Vuh famously says that humans were made from maize dough after earlier creations failed. Now, you have to be careful here. The written version of the Popol Vuh comes from the colonial period, long after the earliest maize farmers, and historians treat it as a preserved indigenous sacred narrative shaped by time, memory, and survival under Spanish rule, but the idea inside it is unmistakable. People did not just grow maize, they understood themselves through maize, and think about that for a second. In many modern kitchens, cornmeal is something you pull from a pantry shelf. It may come in a paper bag, it may sit beside flour, sugar, baking powder, and salt. You might forget it for months until a holiday meal or a pot of beans reminds you. But in ancient Mesoamerica, maize could be the substance from which humanity itself was imagined. That is not a side dish. That is a universe. Among the Maya, maize appears in art, myth, and royal imagery, the maize god, often shown young, elegant, and associated with rebirth, linked agricultural renewal to cosmic order. A sprouting field was not just a field, it was a sign that the world still worked. A harvest was not just calories, it was proof that the relationship between people, land, ancestors, and gods had not broken, in a world where drought could mean hunger, and hunger could mean social collapse. That mattered. This was not decoration, it was political theology. Kings and elites understood that controlling maize production, organizing labor, timing ceremonies, and distributing stored food could strengthen authority. If maize stood near the center of life, then anyone who claimed power over maize's rhythms claimed power over life itself. Leaders performed rituals, communities watched the sky, farmers watched soil and rain, priests interpreted signs. The calendar did not float above daily labor, it leaned on it. Planting mattered, harvest mattered, storage especially. Here is the detail that makes maize powerful in early civilizations. A crop you can dry and store becomes more than food for today. It becomes food for later. It allows planning. It supports specialists who do not farm every day. It feeds workers, artisans, traders, priests, warriors, and builders. It can be collected as tribute. It can be redistributed by rulers. It can be offered to gods. It can be withheld during conflict. It can become mercy, or pressure, or threat. Food is never just food when someone controls the storehouse. Across Mesoamerica, maize helped sustain complex societies long before Europeans arrived. The Olmec world, earlier than the great classic Maya cities, emerged in a region where maize agriculture was part of a broader food system that included beans, squash, fruits, fish, game, and gathered foods. Later Maya cities such as Tikal, Calakmul, Palenque, and Copan depended on agricultural landscapes shaped by terraces, raised fields, gardens, forest management, and local adaptation. This was not one uniform cornfield stretching neatly from horizon to horizon. It was a mosaic. Wetlands, uplands, house gardens, managed forests and fields. That should correct a common mistake. Ancient farming was not primitive because it lacked tractors. It was sophisticated because it understood place. And maize worked best when it was not alone. Beans added protein. Squash spread broad leaves over the soil and produced food of its own. Chili peppers, amaranth, fruits, wild greens, turkeys, fish, and other foods filled out diets in different regions. The famous grouping later called the Three Sisters, maize, beans, and squash, became especially associated with many indigenous agricultural systems in North America. But the deeper principle is broader. Maize thrived inside relationships, plants with plants, people with land, food with ritual, work with memory. No single crop explains everything, but maize explains a lot. Farther west and north, other societies made maize their own in different ways. In the American Southwest, ancestral pueblo and communities grew maize in dry lands where water was precious and planning could mean survival. Imagine fields beneath a hard blue sky, soil cracked in places, irrigation channels or moisture-conserving techniques used with care, stored ears protected because a failed crop could echo for months. Maize in this world was not easy abundance. It was disciplined hope. In the Mississippi Valley and the eastern woodlands, maize eventually became a foundation for larger settlements and chiefdoms. At Cahokia, near present-day St. Louis, a major urban centre rose around 1,000 years ago, with enormous earthen mounds, broad plazas, neighbourhoods, ritual spaces, and agricultural hinterlands. Maize was not the only food there, but it was central to the scale of life that developed. It fed people who built mounds. It supported gatherings. It helped make density possible. Again, not just food, infrastructure. When you hear the word infrastructure today, you may think of bridges, roads, power lines, and broadband cables. In an ancient agricultural society, a reliable grain can be infrastructure. It is the thing beneath the visible thing. Behind a temple, there is a field. Behind a ruler, there is a harvest. Behind a ceremony, there are hands grinding meal before dawn. The sound matters. Stone against stone, kernels crushed into meal, women and men, depending on the culture and task, working through repetitive motions that turn stored grain into daily food. Dust rises, the smell is dry, earthy, faintly sweet when fresh meal warms near fire. Children know the sound before they understand the system that depends on it. It is domestic, but it is also civilizational. The meal becomes porridge, cakes, tamales, flatbreads, drinks, and ceremonial foods. What English speakers later call cornbread is only one descendant in a huge family. That family was already ancient before colonial America existed. Some maize foods were steamed in leaves, some were cooked on flat stones, some were boiled into thick porridges, some were mixed with beans, squash, or meat, some were everyday food, some were ritual food, some were carried on journeys, some were eaten at harvest. Some were offered to beings beyond the human world. Some were humble, some were holy. Often they were both. This is the part modern people can struggle to hold together. Maize could be sacred and ordinary at the same time. It could be placed in ritual and fed to a tired child. It could appear in myth and in the dust of a grinding stone. It could support kings and poor farmers. It could build cities and fill a clay bowl. That double life is not a contradiction. It is exactly why maize mattered so much. The most important foods often live that way: bread in Europe, rice in East Asia, millet and sorghum in parts of Africa, potatoes in the Andes, maize in the Americas. The crop becomes so close to daily life that it becomes difficult to separate biology from belief. You plant it because you must eat. You honor it because without it, you may not live. And long before cornbread reached a colonial hearth, maize had already become one of the great sacred grains of the world. Now the story moves from the field to the fire, and this is where maize becomes something more than a harvested grain sitting in a basket. It becomes food that the human body can actually use well. That sounds obvious. It is not. A kernel of maize is hard, dry, and stubborn. It can be chewed fresh when young, roasted when tender, or boiled if you have time, fuel, and patience. But dried maize, the form that mattered most for storage, does not surrender easily. It has to be cracked, soaked, ground, softened, cooked, or transformed. Without that work, it is not useless, but it is limited. It can fill the belly and still leave the body missing what it needs. Here is the quiet genius hidden in the ashes. Across Mesoamerica, indigenous cooks developed a process now commonly called nixtamalization, from the Nahuatl word nixtamali, referring to maize prepared with an alkaline substance. Dried maize kernels were cooked or soaked with lime, wood ash, or another alkaline material, then washed and ground. The process loosened the hulls, it made grinding easier, it improved flavour, it helped create dough. Most importantly, it made niacin, a crucial B vitamin, more available to the human body. Think about that for a second. This was not a garnish. This was not a culinary flourish. This was biochemistry performed beside a fire. Long before anyone used the word vitamin, people were using ash, lime, water, heat, and time to unlock nutrition inside a grain. They did not need a laboratory to know the result mattered. They saw bodies. They saw hunger. They saw what food sustained people through seasons and which foods did not. The knowledge was practical, inherited, tested, and repeated. You can picture the work. Clay pot sits near the fire, kernels rattle as they are poured in, water darkens, ash or lime is added, steam rises with a mineral smell, earthy and sharp. The pot simmers, the hard skins loosen, hands rinse the softened maize, then comes the grinding, slow and rhythmic. Over a stone surface, the grain changes under pressure. It becomes meal, it becomes mesa, it becomes a substance that can be shaped by hand. That transformation is everything. No grinding, no dough, no cakes, no portable bread, no long work day, no journey, no stored food turning easily into a meal. Storage mattered, but processing made storage useful. This is where many European observers later failed badly. They saw maize foods and often judged them by wheat standards. They compared them to familiar loaves raised with yeast and baked in ovens. They missed the technology because it was not made of metal. They missed the science because it was held in women's hands. Household routines, village practice, and oral teaching. They missed the nutrition because they did not understand what the soaking did. That misunderstanding would have consequences centuries later. But for now, stay close to the ancient hearth. Before cornbread becomes a colonial staple, there are older maize breads and cakes with many forms. Some are flat and cooked on hot stones or clay griddles. Some are wrapped in leaves and steamed. Some are thick enough to carry. Some are soft, meant to be eaten fresh. Some are mixed with beans, squash, chilies, seeds, or meat. Some are everyday food. Some are ceremonial. Some are made quickly. Some require hours of patient preparation. The category is enormous. English later flattens many of these foods into words like corn cake, Indian bread, pone, or cornbread, useful labels, maybe, but also clumsy ones. They hide the diversity that existed before English arrived. Maize was not one food. It was an entire culinary language, and every language has grammar. The grammar of maize cooking included soaking, grinding, mixing, shaping, heating, and sharing. It included knowing how coarse or fine the meal should be. It included knowing when dough needed more water, when a cooking surface was too hot, when a cake would scorch, when steam had done its work. It included the difference between food for travel and food for ceremony, food for children and food for warriors, food for the morning and food for the hungry edge of night. This was not primitive cooking. It was precise cooking with different tools. Stone tools do not make a cuisine simple. Clay pots do not make a cuisine simple. A fire does not make a cuisine simple. In fact, fire demands skill because it is uneven, moody, and unforgiving. One side burns while the other remains raw. Ash blows where it should not. Damp wood smokes. Wind changes everything. Cooking with fire means reading heat through smell, sound, colour, and instinct. Modern ovens hide that knowledge from you. You turn a dial, you wait for a beep. Someone in the ancient world had to judge the heat by the glow of coals, the feel of air against the hand, the colour of stone, the speed of steam, the smell of toasted grain. Too cool, and the cake stayed wet. Too hot, and it blackened. Done well, it became nourishing, portable, and deeply satisfying. A good maize cake in that world was not humble because it was simple. It was humble because it belonged to daily survival. Imagine holding one in your hand. Warm, dense, slightly smoky, maybe wrapped in a leaf, maybe marked by stone or ash. It does not look like a modern square of skillet cornbread, golden and cut cleanly beside a bowl of chili. It is older than that, rougher than that, more direct, grain and water, worked by hand, cooked by fire, eaten because the body needs strength. And here is the important bridge to early America. When European colonists later struggled to grow wheat in unfamiliar soils and climates, they did not invent cornmeal cooking from nothing. They borrowed, learned, adapted, misunderstood, renamed, and often failed to credit indigenous knowledge. They took maize into their kitchens, but they also took techniques and assumptions that had already been refined across thousands of years. The bread that kept early America alive was not born in an English oven. It came from indigenous fields. It came from stone grinding. It came from ash and lime. It came from a long history of cooks who understood that maize had to be transformed before it could truly sustain a people. That is the hidden technology inside cornbread. Not the skillet, not the recipe card, not the nostalgic holiday table, the processing, the knowledge, the hands. The story now begins to move northward, carried not by ships, not by empire, not by a single dramatic conquest, but by seed bags, footpaths, river crossings, marriage ties, trade relationships, hunger, curiosity, and the steady human habit of copying what works. Maize did not remain in southern Mexico. It travelled, slowly at first, then with growing force. It moved through different landscapes and into different lives. It crossed deserts, forests, valleys, plains, river systems, and coastlines. It reached places where the soil behaved differently, where rainfall came at different times, where winters bit harder, where summers stretched hot and green, where people already knew a great deal about local plants and animals, and everywhere maize went, it had to be adjusted. That is the part worth noticing. Maize did not spread as one fixed thing. It adapted. People adapted it. Some varieties matured quickly. Some tolerated drier conditions. Some produced different colours, textures, and flavours. Some became better suited for grinding. Some were useful for roasting fresh. Some stored well. Some could survive in short growing seasons. Some were white. Some were yellow. Some were red. Some were blue. Some were dark enough to look almost black. A modern supermarket often gives you the illusion that corn is one crop. Bright yellow, sweet, uniform, and obedient. Ancient maize was not obedient. It was diverse, local, and shaped by need. If you had to survive on it, you cared deeply about whether it ripened before frost, whether it dried without rotting, whether it ground well, whether it filled a pot, whether it could be saved for the hungry months. This was not about flavour alone. It was about risk. As maize spread into the American Southwest, it entered a world where water could not be taken for granted in places that are now Arizona, New Mexico, Utah, Colorado, and surrounding regions. Farming required attention to rainfall, runoff, springs, floodplains, terraces, and soil moisture. Ancestral Puebloan. Farmers did not simply throw seeds into dust and hope. They developed techniques suited to hard country. They planted in places where scarce water collected. They used check dams, terraces, and careful field placement. They selected varieties that could live with uncertainty. Imagine the scene. A dry morning, pale stone cliffs catching the first light, a field not lush in the way an eastern field might be lush, but alive with deliberate spacing. Hands press kernels into soil that looks too poor to a stranger. Nearby, squash vines spread low, beans climb. Children watch older relatives work and absorb the rhythm of survival without needing a lecture. The air smells of dust, sun-warmed plants, and smoke from a distant cooking fire. In this world, maize was hope measured in inches of rain. Farther east, the crop found other possibilities. In the Mississippi Valley, in the Ohio Valley, along the river systems of the eastern woodlands. Maize eventually helped support larger settlements, more intensive agriculture, and more complex social structures. Rivers mattered here. They carried people, fish, news, goods, and ideas. They also carried crops. A seed could travel with a visitor, a spouse, a trader, a refugee, a captive, or a pilgrim. It could arrive quietly and become central within generations. This is where maize becomes part of a wider agricultural pattern that many people now know as the Three Sisters maize, beans, and squash. The phrase is especially associated with Haudenosaunee and other indigenous agricultural traditions in the northeast. But the combined cultivation of maize, beans, and squash appears in many forms across the Americas. The principle is elegant. Maize grows upright. Beans climb the stalk and help with nitrogen. Squash spreads across the ground, shading soil and discouraging weeds. 3 plants, 1 field, a system, and here is the detail that makes it powerful, together. They also helped balance a diet. Maize provided calories, beans contributed protein, squash added vitamins, seeds, flesh, and storage possibilities. This was not a random garden, it was ecological intelligence in edible form. European colonists would later look at indigenous fields and sometimes describe them as disorderly because they did not resemble neat European rows of wheat. That judgment tells you more about the colonists than about the fields. What they saw as disorder could be an intercropped system tuned to climate, soil, labour, and nutrition. The field was not messy, it was doing several jobs at once. Pay attention to this next detail, because it will matter when cornbread reaches colonial tables. Maize could thrive in places where wheat often struggled. Wheat had expectations. It wanted certain soils, certain seasons, certain milling systems, and in many areas it proved vulnerable to rust, pests, humidity, poor storage, and unfamiliar climate. Maize was not effortless, but it was forgiving in ways that mattered. It could produce heavily. It could be grown by households. It could be dried. It could be pounded into meal without the same kind of infrastructure required for fine wheat flour. No great stone mill required at first, no perfect European-style oven, no landlord's grain system, no delicate white loaf, just corn, labour, and fire. That made maize democratic in one sense and brutally laborious in another. It could feed households far from towns. But someone had to plant it, weed it, guard it, harvest it, shell it, dry it, store it, pound it, grind it, cook it. A full basket of corn did not magically become dinner. The work continued after the harvest. You can hear it in the thud of a wooden mortar, the scrape of stone, the hiss of cakes near coals, the low voices of people working while the light faded. The crop moved north, but so did the work. By around 1,000 years ago, maize had become increasingly important in many regions north of Mesoamerica. Though timing varied widely, some communities adopted it early and deeply, others used it alongside hunting, fishing, gathering, and older cultivated plants. Some resisted dependence, some embraced it, some changed their settlement patterns around it, some used it as one food among many, not the single pillar of life. That variation matters. History is cleaner in maps than it is on the ground, on a map. Arrows show maize spreading north and east, in life. There were arguments, experiments, failures, dry years, stolen harvests, ceremonial plantings, children learning to grind, elders remembering older foods, and communities deciding how much trust to place in a crop that needed care before it gave anything back. Still, the direction is clear. Maize became one of the great connectors of the Americas. It linked regions that never formed one empire. It moved through languages, ceremonies, cuisines, and landscapes. It became a food of villages, towns, chiefdoms, and households. It fed builders at places like Cahokia. It fed farmers in dry country. It fed families along rivers and in forests. It fed travellers who carried parched corn or meal, because dried grain could go where fresh food could not. Storage again. That word keeps returning because the whole story keeps returning to it. Cornbread, at its deepest level, belongs to the history of storage. A fresh ear is seasonal. Meal is flexible. Dried maize can wait. It can survive winter if protected from damp and animals. It can be pounded into something cookable long after green fields are gone. It can become cakes beside a campfire, mush in a pot, or bread on hot stone. The future cornbread of early America is already taking shape here, not as one recipe, but as a survival logic. Grain that stores, meal that travels, fire that transforms. By the time Europeans arrive on the Atlantic coast, maize is not a novelty waiting to be discovered. It is ancient, regional, sophisticated, and deeply embedded in indigenous life. It has crossed half a continent through human intelligence and human need. It has survived deserts, forests, rivers, and winters. It has fed ceremonial centres and small cabins of bark and wood. It has been honoured, traded, planted, eaten, and carried. And when hungry strangers from Europe finally come ashore, they will not understand it at first, but they will need it. By the time Europeans begin arriving along the Atlantic coast of North America, maize is already ancient. It has already travelled thousands of miles. It has already fed villages, supported towns, shaped ceremonies, crossed deserts, filled storehouses, and become part of identities older than any European map of the continent. But the newcomers do not see all that at first. They see a strange grain. Some see tall stalks growing in fields that do not look like European fields. Some see ears wrapped in husks, kernels arranged with unsettling neatness, colours ranging from white to yellow to red to blue. Some see indigenous women grinding meal, some see cakes cooking near coals, some see porridge thickening in pots, some see food that appears coarse compared with wheat bread, and that judgment will follow maize for centuries. Here is the uncomfortable truth. At the beginning of European settlement, many colonists survived because indigenous people already knew how to live there, not in a vague way, not in a symbolic way, literally. At Jamestown, founded in 1607, English colonists arrived with dreams of wealth, trade, and imperial glory. But many were dangerously unprepared for the work of feeding themselves. The settlement sat in a difficult environment, with brackish water, disease, political conflict, and strained relations with nearby indigenous communities during the terrible winter of 1609 to 1610, remembered as the starving time. The colony's population fell from roughly 500 people to about 60. Think about that for a second. This was not a heroic adventure story with a little hunger around the edges. It was catastrophe, disease, desperation, conflict, and failure consumed the settlement. Maize did not magically save Jamestown, and it would be dishonest to pretend it did. But corn was part of the colonial food struggle from the very beginning. English survival depended on obtaining food through trade, diplomacy, coercion, theft, and eventually cultivation. The grain they often treated as inferior became a necessity. That is a pattern you will see again and again. European pride met American reality. American reality won. Farther north, at Plymouth in 1620, the story is more famous and often wrapped in soft holiday imagery. You probably know the broad outline pilgrims, winter, hunger, indigenous assistance, harvest. A meal later remembered as Thanksgiving. The actual history is sharper than the greeting card version. Roughly half the Mayflower passengers died during the first winter. Half cold, illness, poor shelter, and inadequate food turned settlement into survival triage. Then came indigenous knowledge. Tisquantum, often called Squanto in English accounts, a Patuxet man who had been kidnapped, taken across the Atlantic, and returned to a homeland devastated by epidemic disease, taught the English settlers techniques for growing maize in local conditions. The usual classroom version turns him into a cheerful helper in a simple friendship story. The real man's life was far more tragic and politically complicated. He lived through abduction, displacement, disease, and colonial intrusion. Yet his knowledge helped the struggling Plymouth colonists plant and harvest corn. That detail should make you pause. The crop that helped keep English settlers alive came through people whose own worlds were being shattered by European arrival. Cornbread enters colonial history through dependence, but also through violence, loss, and imbalance. The English needed maize. They needed indigenous fields. They needed indigenous instruction. They needed food stores and planting knowledge. At the same time, English expansion would help destroy the very communities whose knowledge made survival possible. This was not a charming exchange of recipes. It was survival inside a colonial collision. Still, inside the kitchens and camps of early settlements, maize began to change European habits. Wheat was the bread grain of status and familiarity for many English colonists. White bread carried cultural prestige. Wheat loaves meant Europe, refinement, order, and comfort. Maize meal by contrast, seemed rough. It lacked gluten, which meant it could not rise like wheat dough. It produced cakes, porridges, mushes, and dense breads rather than airy loaves, to many colonists. That made it second best. But second best food is still food, and in hard seasons, second best becomes beloved very quickly. You have to understand the practical problem. Wheat often struggled in early colonial conditions, especially before settlers understood local soils and seasons. Mills were scarce in new settlements. Ovens required construction, fuel, and stable households. Fine flour was expensive or unavailable. Maize, however, could be grown locally, dried, pounded, and cooked in simpler ways. It did not demand the same infrastructure before it could feed people. No perfect mill, no proper oven, no soft white loaf, just meal, water, salt if you had it, fat if you were lucky, and heat. This is where names begin to multiply. English colonists used words like Indian bread, corn cake, ash cake, pone, journey cake, Johnny cake, hoe cake, mush, samp, and hasty pudding. Some words came from indigenous languages or from English attempts to describe indigenous foods. Some changed meaning by region, some were later romanticized, some origins remain uncertain, which is normal for foods carried by ordinary people rather than preserved in official documents. Governments record treaties and taxes. They rarely record who first flattened meal and water on a hot stone, but the food itself spread. An ash cake could be made by placing dough near or under hot ashes. A hoe cake, in one common explanation, was cooked on the flat blade of a hoe near a fire, though the exact origin of the term is more complicated than the neat story suggests. A journey cake may have referred to a durable corn cake carried while travelling, and later became linked in some tellings to Johnny cake. Hasty pudding was a boiled meal dish, warm and filling, not elegant but efficient. Pone described a kind of cornbread or cake, often without the sweetness modern eaters sometimes expect. These were not just recipes, they were answers to scarcity. Imagine an early colonial kitchen. The room is smoky because chimneys are imperfect and fires do not behave politely. The air smells of damp wool, wood ash, animal fat, and cornmeal. Someone kneels near the hearth, hands dusted with meal, shaping a small cake because dinner cannot wait for refinement. A pot hangs over the fire. Children are hungry. The household has no time for culinary theory. The question is simple. What will fill the body tonight? Cornmeal answers. Not always deliciously, not always gently. Early cornbreads could be dense, gritty, smoky, and plain. If you are imagining a golden square enriched with eggs, butter, buttermilk, and perhaps sugar, slow down. Many early versions were closer to survival cakes than modern comfort food. They could be coarse enough to scrape the throat, hard enough to travel, and plain enough to make a modern diner reach for honey. Dry humour belongs here. Because if you serve some of these early cakes at brunch today, someone would quietly ask whether the restaurant had run out of options. But on a cold frontier evening, they worked, it worked, and that mattered more than softness. Over time, colonists adapted. They learned to mix cornmeal with milk, eggs, animal fat, wheat flour when available, and later chemical leaveners. Regional habits began to form, but in the early period, before abundance, before standardized recipes, before cast iron nostalgia and holiday debates, cornbread was mainly a practical technology borrowed and altered from indigenous foodways. A bread of necessity, a bread of dependence, a bread born from misunderstanding as much as learning. And that is the irony at the centre of this section. Europeans often looked down on maize even as they relied on it. They called indigenous agriculture inferior while copying it. They preferred wheat while eating corn. They imagined themselves bringing civilization, while their survival depended on a crop civilized by others thousands of years earlier. This decision seemed small at the time. It was not. because once maize entered colonial kitchens, it would not stay there quietly. It would follow settlers inland. It would feed forts, farms, travellers, and soldiers. It would become tied to class, race, region, and memory. It would sit on the table of poor families and powerful men. It would become everyday food so common that people stopped seeing the long history inside it. And soon, in the hardest corners of colonial life, cornbread would become one of the foods that kept early America alive. Now you move into the ordinary places where history usually hides, not the battlefield, not the royal court, not the treaty table, the kitchen, the hearth, the cabin, the fort storehouse, the plantation quarter, the frontier clearing where a family looks at a sack of meal and quietly calculates how many days it can last. This is where cornbread becomes more than borrowed food. It becomes routine. It becomes expectation. It becomes the thing that appears when wheat fails, when roads turn to mud, when money is scarce, when the mill is too far away, when hunger is not dramatic enough to enter a history painting but present enough to shape every decision of the day. In colonial America, bread carried status, wheat bread, especially fine white wheat bread, sat higher in the hierarchy of taste and respectability. It looked more European. It rose properly. It belonged to households with better access to mills, markets, ovens, and money. Cornbread, by contrast, often belonged to necessity, coarser, denser, more local, more associated with indigenous foodways, poor households, enslaved people, servants, soldiers, and people living beyond the easy reach of coastal supply. But here's the twist. The lower status bread was often the more useful bread. Cornmeal could be stored, it could be cooked quickly, it could be stretched, it could feed people who did not have a proper oven, a fine mill, or a reliable supply of wheat flour. It could be eaten hot from the ashes, boiled into mush, baked into cakes, fried in fat, or carried on a journey. It could be made plain when there was almost nothing in the house, and enriched when the household had milk, eggs, butter, drippings, or molasses. This was not luxury. It was flexibility. Think about a cold morning in a colonial cabin. The fire has been banked overnight under ash. The room is still dark, except for a low red glow under the hearth. Someone kneels and stirs the coals awake. Smoke lifts. A pot is moved. A little meal is poured into a wooden bowl. Water goes in. Maybe milk. If there is milk, maybe salt. If the salt supply has not run low, the mixture thickens under the hands. There is no recipe card, no measuring cup, no cheerful instruction telling you to preheat anything. The cook knows by feel. Too wet, add meal. Too dry, add water. Too crumbly, press harder. Too hungry, cook faster. That is how much early American cooking happened. By judgment, repetition, and the discipline of making do. Ash cakes were among the simplest forms. Cornmeal mixed with water and perhaps salt could be shaped into a cake and placed near hot ashes or directly among them, protected and turned with care. The result might come out smoky, rough, and darkened in places. You would brush away ash, break it open, and eat the warm centre. It was not delicate. It was not trying to impress anyone. It was food that could exist wherever there was meal and fire. Journey cakes served another need, a traveller moving between settlements, a hunter going into the woods, a labourer away from home, a soldier on the march. All needed food that could travel. Corn cakes could be cooked firm, wrapped, carried, and eaten later. The exact origin of the word Johnny cake remains uncertain, and food historians have offered several possibilities, including a change from journey cake or links to regional terms used in New England and the Caribbean. The documentary trail is not neat. Ordinary foods rarely leave neat trails. But the function is easy to understand. Portable calories, that phrase sounds modern and sterile, but in a world of rough roads and long distances, portable calories were life. A cake of cornmeal in a pouch could mean the difference between reaching a settlement with strength left in your legs and arriving hollowed out by hunger. It could be eaten beside a road, on a riverbank, near a field, in a military camp, or in the doorway of a cabin while the weather turned. It asked very little. That was its power. Pone, too, belonged to this wide family of cornbreads and cakes. The word likely connects to indigenous language roots, often traced to Algonquian terms for baked or roasted food, though exact pathways vary in the surviving record, by the colonial period. Pone could refer to a simple cornbread or cake, usually plain and firm. In many households, it was not a side dish, it was the meal's foundation. Meat, if there was meat, stood beside it. Greens, beans, milk, or broth might complete it. But the cornbread carried the weight. Bread was not decoration. Bread was architecture. It held the meal together. In forts and military outposts, cornmeal mattered because supply was always fragile. A garrison might be far from coastal markets. Roads could fail, wagons could be delayed, spoilage, theft, weather, attack, and mismanagement could turn planned rations into wishful thinking. Cornmeal was not perfect, but it was durable. It could be issued, stored, and cooked in different ways by men with limited equipment. Soldiers complained about rations constantly, because soldiers are human beings, and human beings complain when food is monotonous. But complaint does not mean the food was unimportant. Repetition can save you and still make you miserable. In frontier cabins, cornbread also became a food of domestic endurance. Women, and often girls, carried much of the daily burden of turning grain into meals. That labour can vanish in nostalgic images of rustic life, so bring it back. The hands grinding or pounding meal, the arms lifting pots, the smoke in the eyes, the baby crying while batter is mixed. The older child sent for water, the animal fat saved carefully because wasting grease was almost a moral failure in a hungry household. The constant mental arithmetic of food. How much meal is left? How many mouths tonight? How long until harvest cornbread lived inside those questions? It also crossed class lines, though not equally. Wealthier households might serve finer wheat breads when available. But corn dishes still appeared in many colonial diets, especially in regions where maize grew well. Poorer households relied on it more heavily. Enslaved people were often forced to rely on it under far harsher conditions. And that story will need its own section because the moral stakes are different there, for now. Understand that one food could appear across society while meaning very different things depending on who held power. For one household, cornbread might be thrift. For another, survival. For another, coerced ration. Same grain, different worlds. That is one of the reasons the history of cornbread is so layered. It is tempting to treat it as cozy, rural, and harmless. A skillet on a table, butter melting into a yellow wedge, family stories, regional pride, and yes, those things are part of its life. Food memory matters, comfort matters, but underneath the comfort is a harder history of scarcity, adaptation, unequal labour, and colonial dependence on indigenous knowledge. Early America did not live on wheat alone. Much of it could not. Cornmeal filled the gap. It entered breakfast as mush, dinners as cakes, travel bags as journey bread, and lean evenings as the only reliable thing near the fire. It took smoke into itself. It took ash. It took grease when there was grease, milk when there was milk, and plain water when there was nothing else. It accepted poverty without becoming useless. That is a rare quality in a food, and slowly, through repetition, necessity became culture. People began to prefer certain textures. Some liked a crust, some liked a softer middle, some cooked cakes thin, Some baked loaves thick, some used sour milk, some used eggs, some added sweeteners when they could. Some insisted that proper cornbread should be plain, even before the famous later argument over sugar. The bread was already regional, personal, and emotional. That is how survival foods become identity foods. At first, you eat them because you must. Then you eat them because they taste like home. And by the time the American colonies move toward revolution, cornmeal is no longer just an indigenous crop adopted by Europeans under pressure. It is woven into daily colonial life. It sits in storerooms, kettles, haversacks, cabins, slave quarters, taverns, and military supply lists. It feeds people who disagree about almost everything except the basic fact that hunger cannot wait. Soon, armies will march on it. And hunger will test whether a rebellion can survive on more than speeches. By the time the American colonies move into open rebellion, cornmeal has already become part of the ordinary machinery of survival. It sits in barrels, sacks, kitchens, taverns, cabins, mills, farmhouses, slave quarters, and storehouses. It is not glamorous. It does not appear in patriotic paintings beside flags and drums. It does not give speeches. It does not sign declarations, but armies cannot eat declarations. They need food that can be gathered, stored, hauled, issued, cooked, and swallowed in weather that does not care about ideals. They need calories that will not spoil immediately. They need something a tired soldier can turn into a meal without a proper kitchen. They need something that can survive bad roads, weak supply systems, corrupt contractors, frightened farmers, and money that loses value faster than anyone can spend it. Cornmeal did not win the American Revolution by itself. No single food did, but it helped keep men alive in a war where hunger was never a side issue. Hunger was strategy. Hunger was morale. Hunger was desertion. Hunger was disease. Hunger was the difference between an army and a crowd of exhausted men walking home. Pay attention to this next detail, because it explains the weakness of the American war effort. The Continental Army was not supported by a strong modern state. It had no smooth national tax system, no vast railroad network, no refrigerated supply chain, no reliable paper currency, no easy way to force every colony, and later every state, to feed the same army at the same time. Congress could request, officials could plead, quartermasters could scramble, but food had to come from farms, mills, storehouses, wagons, rivers, contractors, and local politics. The system was fragile. At the center of that system was bread. Not always bread in the narrow sense. Soldiers received flour, hard bread, biscuit, meal, or grain depending on what could be obtained. In theory, rations might include bread or flour, meat, peas, beans, rice, milk, soap, candles, rum, or other items. In practice, theory often collapsed before it reached the camp kettle. A ration list on paper can look orderly. A soldier's stomach knew better. Sometimes meat arrived spoiled. Sometimes flour failed. Sometimes wagons never came. Sometimes the men got cornmeal. A soldier with cornmeal could make mush, cakes, or crude bread if he had water, fire and time if he had salt. The food improved if he had fat. It improved more if he had milk or eggs, which were unlikely on campaign. It became almost luxurious by military standards. But even plain cornmeal mattered. It could be boiled into something warm. It could be baked quickly. It could be carried. It could be stretched. Warmth mattered too. Do not underestimate that. A hot meal in a cold camp was not merely nutrition. It was morale you could hold in a wooden bowl. Imagine the sound of a winter encampment, axe striking frozen wood, men coughing in tents, horses stamping, mud freezing at night and thawing into misery by noon, smoke hanging low over the huts. Somewhere, Someone stirs cornmeal into water because the body wants heat as much as it wants fullness. The smell is plain, slightly sweet, smoky from the fire, and maybe touched with grease if there is any to spare. It is not heroic food, it is food that keeps the next hour possible. The winter at Valley Forge, beginning in 1777 and stretching into 1778, remains the most famous hunger scene of the Revolutionary War. It has also been covered in layers of legend. The army did not starve in the simple sense that every man had no food at all, and historians have revised some of the older heroic myths. But the suffering was real. Supply failures were real. Nakedness, sickness, cold, and hunger were real. Thousands of soldiers were unfit for duty at points during the winter. Men lacked shoes, blankets, shirts, and reliable rations. This was not just bad luck, it was logistics failing under political pressure. George Washington understood that an army without food could dissolve. In his letters during the war, he repeatedly worried over supplies, transportation, flour, meat, forage, and the inability of civil authorities to meet military needs. He did not need poetic language to make the point. Hunger spoke plainly. Men who were not fed could not fight. Men whose enlistments expired might not stay. Men who felt abandoned could desert. The revolution could fail not in one grand battle, but through empty barrels. That is the part textbooks often underplay. Revolutions need bakers, they need millers, farmers, wagoners, coopers, butchers, clerks, purchasers, teamsters, and cooks. They need people who can turn grain into ration and ration into endurance. The mythology of war loves the battlefield because it is dramatic, but in a long war, supply is drama. A road blocked by snow can matter as much as a cannon. A barrel of meal can be more important than a speech. A broken wagon wheel can change a campaign. And cornmeal had one advantage that wheat flour did not always have. It was local to many American regions in a way wheat was not. Farmers in the middle and southern colonies grew maize widely. Corn could feed people and animals. It could become meal for soldiers, fodder for livestock, and whiskey when turned into another form of stored value. It was part of the agricultural base that allowed scattered communities to support war. However unevenly and reluctantly matters. Not every farmer eagerly handed over grain to the army. Some wanted hard money, not depreciating paper currency. Some feared taking sides. Some sold to whoever paid better, including British forces in certain circumstances. Some hid supplies. Some had little to spare. Some were themselves hungry. War turns food into politics very quickly. A bushel of corn was not just a bushel of corn. It was allegiance. It was survival. It was price. It was power. Inflation made everything worse. Continental currency declined badly during the war, leading to the famous phrase "not worth a continental" when paper money loses trust. Food becomes more difficult to buy because farmers do not want payment that may become nearly worthless. This is not abstract economics. Imagine a farmer standing beside sacks of grain, deciding whether to accept paper that might not buy salt next month. Imagine a quartermaster desperate to feed men before they mutiny. Imagine soldiers watching both men argue while their own stomachs tighten. That is war behind the war. Cornbread and cornmeal foods moved through this world as practical answers. In camps, soldiers could make ash cakes or hoe cakes with minimal equipment. In homes, women cooked for families while also facing requisitions, shortages, and the absence of men. In taverns and supply points, meal might be baked, boiled, or issued. Among poorer families, cornmeal stretched scarce wheat. Among frontier communities, it remained central because distance from markets did not pause for revolution. No elegance, no abundance, no guarantee, just enough sometimes and sometimes not enough. The Revolutionary War also hardened the association between maize and American difference. Wheat remained desirable, especially among those who could afford it. But corn increasingly belonged to the material reality of the new country. Europe had wheat prestige, America had maize practicality. The young republic did not invent itself over a single food, but corn was everywhere in its daily survival, especially outside elite dining rooms. This was not the bread of kings. It was the bread of camps, cabins, fields, and roads. That made it powerful in a quieter way. Cornbread did not ask for refinement. It didn't require perfect conditions. It could be made badly and still feed someone. It could be eaten plain and still matter. It could be carried by a soldier who had heard grand words about liberty, but still needed something real in his hand before marching. Think about that contrast for a second. The revolution spoke in universal ideals, natural rights, representation, sovereignty, and liberty. But under those words were men stirring meal in kettles, women stretching grain in kitchens, enslaved people producing food under coercion, indigenous communities facing expansion, and farmers weighing whether to sell, hide, or surrender their stores. America's founding was not fed by rhetoric alone, it was fed by corn. And as the war dragged on, that humble fact became impossible to ignore. Cornmeal could not solve the army's supply crisis. It could not prevent disease. It could not mend shoes, cure smallpox, or stop inflation. But it could become breakfast. It could become supper. It could become one more day of endurance in a war of endurance. One more day matters. Soon, though, the story must turn darker. Because the same grain that helped hungry soldiers and poor families survive also became part of a ration system built on forced labour, calculated deprivation, and human bondage. Cornbread kept early America alive. Yes, but America was never one experience. For some, cornmeal meant resilience. For others, it meant survival under enslavement. Now the story enters the part that has to be told carefully. Cornbread kept early America alive, but early America was not one household, one table, or one kind of hunger. The same grain that helped soldiers survive winter and settlers endure isolation also appeared in one of the most brutal food systems in the Atlantic world. It was measured, withheld, stretched, and used to keep enslaved people alive enough to work while denying them comfort, autonomy, and full nourishment. This was not accidental. It was management. Plantation owners did not provide cornmeal because they were generous. They provided it because human beings forced to labor still had to be fed enough to keep producing wealth for someone else. That is the cold logic of slavery, and you should not soften it. Enslaved people were not merely living in poverty. They were living under a system that treated their hunger as a cost calculation. Cornmeal was central to that calculation. On many plantations in the Chesapeake, the Carolinas, Georgia, and later the expanding Cotton South, rations often included cornmeal and some form of salted pork, fish, or other preserved meat when available. The exact amounts varied by region, owner, crop, season, and local practice. But a common pattern was weekly distribution a peck or more of cornmeal, perhaps several pounds of meat, sometimes molasses or vegetables, often not enough, often poor in quality, often handed out with the expectation that enslaved families would somehow make the ration last. That expectation carried cruelty inside it. Imagine the scene, not as nostalgia, but as a ration line. The air is humid, the smell of animals, smoke, damp earth, and stored grain hangs near the quarters. A measured amount of meal is handed over, not chosen, not purchased, not shared as hospitality, issued. The person receiving it may have worked since before sunrise and may work again until dark, Children are waiting. Elders are waiting. The meal has to become mush, cakes, bread, something, anything. The week is long. The ration is not love, or it is control. Here is the uncomfortable reality cornmeal helps sustain enslaved communities, but it also helps sustain slavery itself. Plantation slavery depended on extracting labor while minimizing expense. Food rations were part of that economy. Clothing allowances, housing, medical care, and food were all calculated within a system designed around forced production. Sugar did this in the Caribbean. Cotton did this in the American South. Tobacco did this in the Chesapeake. Rice did this in the Low Country, and corn, often grown nearby as a provision crop, helped feed the labor force that made those profits possible. Cornbread did not just sit beside slavery, it was inside slavery's daily machinery. That does not mean enslaved people had no agency in food, quite the opposite. This is where the story becomes both painful and astonishing. Within violent constraints, enslaved cooks, mothers, fathers, gardeners, hunters, fishers, and elders transformed limited rations into meals that carried skill, memory, and dignity. They stretched cornmeal with greens, beans, wild plants, garden produce, game, fish, okra, peppers, and whatever could be raised, gathered, trapped, traded, or quietly acquired. They built food cultures under pressure. That was not romantic resilience, it was survival intelligence under coercion. Many enslaved people maintained small garden plots when allowed, sometimes growing vegetables, herbs, and other foods for household use or for sale in local markets. Some raised chickens, some fished, some hunted at night or on limited personal time. Some cooked in plantation kitchens, where they learned, shaped, and preserved culinary techniques that would later influence Southern cooking more broadly. But do not let later praise for cuisine blur the central fact. The system that produced these adaptations was violent. Skill existed because people refused to be reduced to rations. Cornmeal became ash cakes, hoe cakes, pone, dumplings, mush, and other forms depending on ingredients and cooking conditions. In quarters where ovens were limited or absent, a hearth, skillet, hoe blade, or hot ashes could turn meal into bread, if fat was available. The bread changed. If sour milk was available, it changed again. If the meal was fresh and well ground, it cooked differently than if it was coarse, old, or musty. Every detail mattered because there was so little margin. A good cook could make scarcity taste less like defeat, but scarcity remained. Food could be used as punishment. Rations could be reduced. Supplies could be spoiled. Time to cook could be limited by work demands. Malnutrition weakened bodies already exhausted by labor. Pregnant women, children, the sick, and the elderly faced particular danger when food was inadequate. Plantation records often discuss provisions in language that sounds brutally ordinary, as if human hunger were simply a ledger entry. That is part of what makes the documents so chilling. They do not always shout cruelty, sometimes they whisper it in numbers. A peck of meal, a few pounds of pork, a week. Think about that for a second. A week. The darker irony is that maize itself had indigenous roots in systems of seasonal care, storage, ceremony, and adaptation in plantation slavery. That crop was pulled into an economy of forced labor and racial domination. A grain once cultivated through communal knowledge now moved through ration systems controlled by enslavers. The bread that could represent household endurance in one setting could represent coerced subsistence in another. Same food, different power. This is why food history has to be honest. If you only tell the warm story, you end up with a skillet, a family table, and a golden crust. If you only tell the brutal story, you miss the creativity and memory of people who made life under impossible conditions. Both truths sit together. Cornbread was used by enslavers as cheap sustenance. Cornbread was also shaped by enslaved people into something meaningful, practical, and culturally enduring. That tension never fully disappears. In the Low Country, where rice plantations created some of the harshest labour regimes in British North America and later the United States, cornmeal still had a place among rations and side foods, even when rice dominated plantation wealth in the tobacco regions, where labour cycles were grueling and land was exhausted over time. Corn helped feed people and livestock in the Cotton South. As slavery expanded westward after the invention of the cotton gin, corn became part of the agricultural base that supported plantations moving into Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Arkansas, and Texas. Corn fed the workers, workers made the profits, profits drove expansion, expansion spread slavery. That chain is blunt because it needs to be blunt. And yet, inside the quarters, foodways developed that would later help shape African American cuisine and Southern food traditions. Cornbread became linked with greens, beans, pot liquor, smoked meats, and skillet cooking. It carried African, indigenous, and European influences, but under conditions that were not equal. Enslaved Africans and their descendants brought techniques, tastes, ingredients, and agricultural knowledge of their own. Indigenous maize traditions already shaped the landscape. European tools and livestock changed the kitchen. The result was not one pure origin, it was a forced, creative, painful blending under unequal power. Food can remember what official history tries to smooth over. When people today argue about cornbread, sweet or unsweet, white meal or yellow meal, skillet or baking pan, crumbly or tender, they're often arguing over family memory. But beneath family memory is regional history. Beneath regional history is class. Beneath class is race. Beneath race is labour. And beneath labour, in early America, there's often coercion. This does not make cornbread guilty. Food is not guilty. Systems are. But food can reveal a system with unnerving clarity. What people are fed, who cooks it, who controls the grain, who eats first, who eats last, who chooses, who waits, who owns the field, who owns the body. These questions tell you what kind of society you're looking at. On plantations, cornbread was not just bread, it was ration, it was endurance, it was control. It was also, in the hands of enslaved cooks and families, one of the materials from which survival, community, and cultural memory were made. That is a hard dual meaning. But history is full of hard dual meanings. And as America moved toward independence, then nationhood, then expansion, that dual meaning travelled with it. Cornbread would feed poor white farmers and enslaved black families. It would appear in cabins and quarters, on campaign trails and plantation tables. It would become comfort food and deprivation food, identity food and ration food. A humble bread can carry a heavy burden. This one does. By the time the United States begins to take shape as a new nation, cornbread has already entered too many kitchens to belong to one people, one class, one region, or one meaning. It is in poor cabins and plantation quarters. It is in taverns and farmhouses. It is in soldiers' memories and travellers' packs. It is on tables where wheat bread is rare, and on tables where wheat bread is preferred. But cornmeal still waits nearby because practicality has a way of outliving pride. Now the bread begins to divide, not because corn itself changes suddenly, but because America does. Roads widen, markets grow, mills improve, settlement pushes inland, plantation slavery expands, regional identities sharpen, cookbooks begin to record what oral tradition had long carried, and little by little, cornbread stops being merely a survival answer and becomes a cultural argument. You can hear the argument even now. Should cornbread be sweet? Should it be white or yellow? Should it be baked in a skillet? Should it crumble? Should it be soft? Should flour touch it at all? These questions sound small, almost comic, but food arguments are rarely only about food. They are about memory, class, race, region, childhood, scarcity, pride, and the powerful human need to say, "This is how we did it, and therefore this is how it should be done." In the early Republic in the 19th century, the differences were not yet standardized into the tidy regional stereotypes people repeat today. Recipes varied household by household. One cook had buttermilk, another had only water. One had eggs, another saved eggs for selling. One had molasses, another had none. One baked in a Dutch oven, another cooked cakes on a griddle. One had finely ground meal from good mill, another had coarse meal pounded closer to home. A recipe was not just taste, it was circumstance. In New England, cornmeal entered a world already shaped by older English food habits. Hasty pudding, made from cornmeal boiled in water or milk, became a familiar dish. So did Johnny cakes, especially in Rhode Island and nearby regions, where thin corn cakes cooked on a board. Stone or griddle developed strong local associations. The name Johnny cake is one of those food words that attracts neat explanations, and neat explanations are often suspicious. Some traditions connect it to journey cake, a cake suitable for travel. Others point to older regional usages. The evidence does not settle into one comfortable answer. But the function is clear. Cornmeal became breakfast, supper, travel food, and filler. It sat beside beans, salt pork, milk, fish, molasses, and whatever else a household could afford. In some New England homes, cornmeal and rye flour were combined into what became known as rye and Indian bread, often shortened to brown bread. That bread, steamed or baked, belonged to a climate and cuisine where wheat was not always the obvious daily staple. It was dense, dark, practical, and deeply regional. Farther south, cornbread took on different meanings. In the Chesapeake, the Carolinas, Georgia, Tennessee, Kentucky, and the wider upland and lowland South. Corn grew well and became central to everyday cooking. Hoe cakes, ash cakes, dodgers, pones, spoon breads, and skillet breads appeared in different settings. Some were thin and crisp, some were thick and plain, some were baked in hot fat, some were close to pudding, some were nearly all meal. Some softened with eggs and milk when those were available. The southern cornbread tradition was not born as one recipe. It was a family of solutions. The skillet deserves attention here. Cast iron became one of the great tools of American cooking because it was durable, versatile, and able to handle open hearths, stoves, ovens, and hard daily use. A well-heated skillet could create the crust that later became almost a theology in some households. Batter hitting hot fat makes a sound that should be considered part of the recipe. A sharp hiss, a small violence. The edges seize first. The smell rises quickly. Toasted corn, grease, heat, and promise. That crust matters because texture matters when ingredients are plain. A crisp edge can make a simple bread feel abundant. A tender center can make poverty easier to swallow. A little bacon grease can turn meal and water into something remembered for a lifetime. In many households, especially poorer ones, cornbread carried the flavor of whatever fat could be spared. Lard, drippings, butter if there was butter. Grease saved in a jar because throwing away fat would have been absurd. If modern prosperity makes people wasteful, hunger makes people exact. Nothing useful was casual. This is also where class starts shaping taste in complicated ways. Wheat flour remained associated with refinement and status in many places. Cornmeal was often linked with rural life, poverty, and necessity, though it was also beloved as industrial milling improved and wheat flour became more available. Some households used wheat flour to lighten cornbread. Sugar also entered recipes in some regions and periods, especially where molasses, sugar, or later refined sugar became accessible. But in poorer southern settings, especially where stone-ground cornmeal was naturally sweet and fresh, unsweetened cornbread remained common. The later sugar debate is partly about history, partly about identity, and partly about people pretending their grandmother represented an entire region. She did not. No one's grandmother did. Still, the debate reveals something real. For many Southerners, especially in the 20th century, unsweetened skillet cornbread became a marker of authenticity. Sweet cornbread was sometimes dismissed as cake, northern, commercial, or soft. In other households, sweetened cornbread was normal, beloved, and absolutely not considered suspicious. Food identities are often built from selective memory. People defend what fed them, and cornbread fed many different people. There were also dishes that blurred the line between bread, pudding, and spoon food. Spoon bread, associated especially with parts of the South, used cornmeal with milk, eggs, and sometimes leavening to create a softer, almost custard-like dish. Corn dodgers were small, firm breads often baked or fried, useful enough to travel and plain enough to sit beside beans or greens. Crackling bread used bits of rendered pork crackling stirred into the batter, a brilliant way to preserve flavour and calories from butchering season. Corn pone could be almost austere, a compact declaration that you had meal, water, heat, and not much else. Each variation tells you something not just about taste, about access. Eggs meant chickens, milk meant cows or access to dairy. Wheat flour meant milling and market connection. Sugar meant purchase power or trade. Fat meant animals, butchering, or careful saving. A recipe is a household inventory pretending to be a tradition. Meanwhile, enslaved cooks and later free black cooks shaped cornbread traditions in profound ways, though their names were often not written down. They cooked in plantation kitchens, in their own quarters, in urban households, in rural cabins, and later in churches, restaurants, and family kitchens. Cornbread became part of African American foodways not because history was gentle, but because people transformed what they had into sustaining cuisine: greens and cornbread, beans and cornbread. Pot liquor soaked into bread, a meal plain enough to be born of hardship and strong enough to become memory. This was not one America dividing neatly into North and South. It was many Americas, each putting cornmeal through its own conditions. On the frontier, cornbread remained practical. Settlers moving west relied on corn because it was productive, adaptable, and useful for humans and animals. In Appalachian communities, cornmeal became central to daily foodways, shaped by mountain isolation, small farms, hunting, hog raising, and limited access to market flour. In the Midwest, corn would become part of vast agricultural systems, feeding livestock, families, and later industries in native communities. Maize traditions continued despite displacement, pressure, and violence, preserving older foodways even as settler America claimed corn as its own. That claim is one of the quiet thefts inside the story. A crop domesticated by indigenous peoples became branded as American. A bread built from indigenous knowledge became treated as rustic national heritage. That does not mean later cornbreads were fake. Culture really does change through contact, adaptation, and use. But remembering the origin matters, otherwise the skillet erases the field. By the late 19th century, regional cornbreads had become part of identity. They appeared in cookbooks, household manuals, plantation memories, travel writing, and local tradition. Some writers praised them as wholesome and American. Others treated them as coarse country food. The bread could be humble, mocked, celebrated, racialized, romanticized, and eaten daily, sometimes all at once. That is how powerful everyday foods work. They sit quietly on the plate while absorbing everything around them. Cornbread was no longer just keeping people alive, though it still did that for many. It was becoming a way Americans marked place and belonging. New England Johnny cakes, Southern skillet bread, Appalachian pone, plantation hoe cakes, frontier dodgers, black family recipes, native maize traditions, poor people's bread, holiday bread, breakfast bread, supper bread, one crop, many memories. And as the nation moved westward, that bread would travel with it through some of the most violent chapters in American history. Now cornbread moves west, but it does not travel through an empty country. That sentence matters. In older frontier stories, expansion often appears as a clean line of cabins, wagons, axes, ploughs, and brave families moving into open land. The camera follows the settler. The map fills with farms. The word wilderness does a great deal of work, too much work, because the land was not empty. It was home. It was hunted ground, burial ground, farming ground, ceremonial ground, treaty ground, and memory. Corn was already there in many places, grown, traded, honoured, stored, and eaten by indigenous peoples long before the United States pushed across the continent. So when cornbread travels west with settlers, soldiers, missionaries, enslavers, traders, and migrants, it travels inside a story of hunger and violence at the same time. This is where the bread becomes complicated again. For a settler family on the edge of a clearing, cornmeal might mean survival. For the native community being pushed away from that clearing, cornmeal might mark the loss of fields tended for generations. For the soldier in a frontier post, it might be ration. For the displaced family on a forced march, it might be too little, too late, and handed out by the very government responsible for removal. Same grain, different power. During the late 18th and 19th centuries, the United States expanded through treaties, purchases, wars, fraud, pressure, debt, and forced removal. The language of growth often sounded smooth: settlement, improvement, development. But on the ground, it meant fences cutting across movement routes, farms replacing hunting grounds, military roads, land offices, surveys, forts, and the steady shrinking of indigenous sovereignty. Cornfields were part of this struggle because farming was never merely farming. A field made a claim. Planting said, "We intend to remain." That was true for indigenous communities. It was true for settlers. It was true for states. And when claims collided, the violence could be devastating. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 gave federal support to a policy of forcing native nations east of the Mississippi River to move westward. The most infamous result was the forced removal of the Cherokee people in 1838 and 1839, remembered as the Trail of Tears. Thousands of Cherokee people died from exposure, disease, exhaustion, and hunger during and around the removal process. The exact number remains difficult to pin down because records are incomplete, and suffering rarely fits cleanly into official paperwork. But estimates often point to roughly 4,000 deaths. 4,000, think about that for a second. A government that spoke of civilization and progress forced people from homes, fields, orchards, towns, graves, and food systems. Corn was not incidental to that loss. Southeastern native nations, including the Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, and Seminole, had long agricultural traditions. They grew maize, beans, squash, and other crops. They built food systems adapted to their landscapes. Removal broke more than political boundaries. It broke harvest cycles, seed keeping, local knowledge, and the food security of entire communities. This was not relocation, it was rupture. And here is one bitter detail. Federal officials sometimes described removal as orderly, rational, even humane. The bodies on the road told another story. Mud, cold, illness, weak supplies, failed logistics, grief, and the smell of campfires along forced routes. Imagine a family carrying what they can. A child too tired to walk, a pot that once belonged in a home kitchen now used beside a temporary camp, cornmeal, if available, stretched with water into something warm because warmth is one of the few mercies left when everything familiar has been taken. Bread can comfort. Bread can also expose the cruelty of the world that made comfort necessary. Meanwhile, settler families moving west relied heavily on corn because it fit the conditions of expansion. Wheat might come later when mills, markets, and better established farms arrived. Corn often came first. It grew quickly enough to help a new household survive. It fed people, pigs, chickens, horses, and cattle. It could be planted in newly cleared ground. It could be dried and stored. It could become meal, mush, cakes, whiskey, fodder, and trade. No crop was more practical for the American frontier. A family might arrive with seed corn wrapped carefully, because the first planting mattered more than almost anything else. Before a proper house, before a comfortable bed, before a painted door, there had to be food, a small clearing, a crude fence if possible, a patch of corn. The work was dirty, anxious, and repetitive. Trees had to be cut, roots had to be fought, soil had to be broken, birds and animals had to be discouraged, weather had to cooperate. It often did not. When harvest came, relief was physical. You can feel it in the hands, ears pulled from stalks, husks drying, kernels shelled, meal pounded or carried to a mill if one was within reach. A first good corn crop on a new farm meant the family might endure winter. A failed crop could mean debt, hunger, sickness, or leaving. Cornbread in this context was not nostalgic frontier charm. It was a calculation baked near a fire. How much meal remains? How long until spring? How many people are coming to supper? The answer might be ash cakes one night, mush the next, hoe cakes the next, and cold leftovers crumbled into milk if milk existed. It might be cornbread beside beans because beans could stretch the meal into something fuller. It might be corn dodgers carried by men working away from the cabin. It might be a pone baked hard enough to last. It might be plain enough to make a modern person sigh and reach for jam. But it kept bodies moving. That was the point. Corn also followed slavery west. As cotton plantations expanded into the Deep South after the invention of the cotton gin in the 1790s, enslavers pushed forced labor into new territories: Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Arkansas, and Texas became part of a violent agricultural expansion where cotton was the cash crop. But corn was one of the provision crops that helped sustain plantations. Enslaved people planted it, harvested it, ground it, cooked it, and ate it under ration systems shaped by coercion. Expansion was not just wagons, it was coffles. It was forced marches of enslaved people sold away from families in the Upper South to the cotton frontier. It was land taken from native nations and worked by enslaved labor. It was cornfields feeding the people forced to make cotton profitable. That is the brutal triangle beneath many neat maps of American growth removal. Slavery and settlement. Cornbread sits there too, not as the villain, but as evidence. It shows you how ordinary life continued inside extraordinary injustice. People still had to eat, fires still had to be lit, children still needed breakfast, soldiers still needed rations, settlers still needed harvests, displaced families still needed warmth, enslaved cooks still had to turn ration meal into food. The daily necessity of bread did not pause because history became violent. It became more necessary. That is why everyday commodities are so revealing. They do not let you hide inside speeches and flags. They bring you back to the mouth, The hand, the field, the ration, the kitchen, the road. Cornbread went west as survival bread. But survival for one group could be built on dispossession of another. It fed new cabins while older homes were abandoned by force. It filled soldiers while armies enforced removal. It sustained enslaved people while slavery expanded. It accompanied poor settlers who themselves often lived close to hunger, even as their presence helped advance a system that destroyed indigenous life. No clean story, no simple plate. By the middle of the 19th century, cornbread had become inseparable from the expansion of the United States. It belonged to frontier endurance, but also to frontier violence. It belonged to poor households, military posts, plantation fields, native foodways under pressure, and migrant families pushing into uncertain country. It was still cheap, filling, flexible, and reliable. It was still doing what it had always done, keeping people alive. But now the question was harder. Alive for what kind of country? Then war returns to the cornfield. By 1861, the United States is no longer merely arguing over territory, labor, sovereignty, and slavery. It is breaking apart. Armies gather, rail lines become military arteries, rivers become invasion routes, farms become supply bases, mills become targets, barns become strategic assets, and once again, beneath the speeches, uniforms, flags, and cannon smoke, there is the same old question: what will people eat? The American Civil War was not only a war of battles, it was a war of supply. It was a war of railroads, rivers, warehouses, salt works, livestock, flour, bacon, beans, coffee, and cornmeal. Soldiers could march with ideals in their heads, but if rations failed, those ideals did not fill the stomach. Civilians could speak of loyalty and sacrifice, but if crops were trampled, mills burned, prices soared, and children cried from hunger, loyalty became harder to cook. Cornbread stood close to the center of that experience, especially in the South. Not because it was new, by then it was deeply familiar. But war stripped food down to essentials, and cornbread was an essential food. It could be made from local cornmeal when wheat flour became scarce. It could be baked in a skillet, shaped into dodgers, cooked as hoe cakes, crumbled into broth, eaten with peas, beans, greens, molasses, sorghum, or nothing at all. It could be plain enough to break your heart and still useful enough to keep you alive. This was not comfort food first. It was wartime infrastructure. At the beginning of the war, both Union and Confederate armies relied on ration systems that looked more orderly on paper than in practice. Union soldiers often had better supply networks as the war went on, especially because the North had stronger industry, more railroads, more ships, and greater access to manufactured goods. Confederate supply was more fragile from the start and grew worse under blockade. Inflation, transportation breakdown, crop disruption, and government mismanagement. Food became uneven. Some soldiers had enough for a while, some did not, some foraged, some stole, some traded, some lived for days on hardtack and coffee, some boiled whatever grain or meal they could find. In Confederate armies, especially later in the war, cornmeal often replaced wheat flour in rations because it was more available across parts of the South. Men made corn dodgers, ash cakes, and crude breads near campfires, sometimes with little more than meal, water, and salt if salt could be found. If salt could be found, that detail matters because war touched every ingredient. Salt was essential for preserving meat, seasoning food, and keeping both humans and animals supplied. The Union blockade and military attacks on salt works made salt shortages severe in parts of the Confederacy without salt. Pork spoiled more easily without pork. Cornmeal lost one of its key companions without fat. bread became harder, drier, less sustaining. A simple meal suddenly depended on a whole chain of things that war could break. Cornmeal, salt, pork, fire, break one link and dinner changes, break several, and hunger enters the room. On the home front, the pressure could be even sharper. Southern civilians, especially women managing households while men were away, faced rising prices and shrinking supplies. Confederate currency lost value badly. Goods became scarce. Coffee disappeared or became too expensive for many. Wheat flour was difficult to obtain in some areas. Cloth, shoes, medicine, and salt all became problems. Cornmeal remained one of the more available staples, but available didn't mean easy, and staple did not mean enough. Imagine a woman in Georgia, Virginia, Mississippi, or the Carolinas standing at a work table in a dim kitchen. The war has already taken someone from the household, maybe a husband, maybe a son, maybe several. News comes slowly and badly. The garden has to be tended. Children need food. Enslaved people, in households that still hold them, continue to labour under a system now being shaken by war. Refugees pass through. Soldiers appear without warning. Prices rise again. The meal barrel is checked with a hand, not a measuring chart. How low, how many days, how much can be spared? Cornbread becomes thinner, smaller, coarser. Leftovers matter more, crumbs matter, grease matters. A spoonful of sorghum or molasses, if available, can make a hard meal easier to swallow. Dried peas, beans, greens, and whatever meat remains become companions to bread because bread alone may fill but not satisfy. In some places, people roasted parched corn, made corn coffee substitutes, stretched flour with cornmeal, and turned every scrap of food into another day. War teaches thrift with a hard hand. In Richmond, the Confederate capital, food shortages helped produce one of the most revealing civilian crises of the war. In April of 1863, hundreds of women, many poor and working class, marched through the city demanding bread. The event is often called the Richmond Bread Riot. Though the crowd demanded food more broadly than bread alone, prices had risen dramatically. Families were hungry. The march turned into looting. Jefferson Davis addressed the crowd and reportedly threw money from his pockets. Though details of the scene vary in later accounts, armed force eventually dispersed the women. This was not merely disorder, it was hunger becoming politics. Think about that for a second. A government fighting for independence from the Union could not feed its own capital's poor women and children reliably enough to prevent a public eruption. That does not mean every Confederate household starved. Class, region, and access mattered enormously. Wealthier people could often manage better. Rural households with land might survive better than urban labourers. But the riot exposed a truth that governments hate to face. No cause can remain abstract when people cannot buy food. Bread becomes a referendum. Cornbread was part of the survival landscape behind that crisis. In kitchens and camps, in towns and cabins, in enslaved quarters and refugee shelters. Cornmeal appeared again because it was often what remained when other foods failed. But the Civil War also changed who controlled the cooking and eating, as Union armies advanced through the South. Enslaved people fled to Union lines, withheld labor, gathered information, joined the war effort, and remade the meaning of food and freedom. A ration issued by the Union Army to formerly enslaved people carried a different meaning from cornmeal issued by an enslaver. Same meal, new context, not freedom fully, not equality, not safety, but a crack in the old order. At the same time, military campaigns devastated agricultural regions. Armies foraged from farms, livestock was taken, mills were destroyed, railroads were torn apart. In the Shenandoah Valley in 1864, Union forces under Philip Sheridan carried out a campaign of destruction meant to cripple Confederate supply. barns, mills, crops, and livestock were targeted in Georgia and the Carolinas. Sherman's campaigns also struck at the material base of Confederate war-making. This was warfare aimed not only at soldiers, but at the food systems behind them. The cornfield became a battlefield without needing a cannon in it, and for civilians, that meant fear you could smell. Smoke from burned barns, spoiled grain, empty cribs, animals gone, mills silent. The usual sounds of survival interrupted. No grinding, no wagon arriving, no full storehouse, just uncertainty where routine used to be. After Appomattox in 1865, the war ended, but hunger did not politely end with it. Across the South, farms were damaged, labor systems transformed, money unstable, and millions of formerly enslaved people faced freedom without land, wealth, or secure food access. Cornbread continued to feed people through Reconstruction, poverty, tenancy, sharecropping, and the long aftermath of war. It remained cheap, local, familiar, and adaptable. It had survived another national crisis, but notice what had changed. Cornbread had begun as indigenous food technology, then colonial survival bread, then plantation ration, then regional identity, then frontier staple, then wartime necessity by the end of the Civil War. It carried almost the entire American story inside it: indigenous knowledge, settler hunger, slavery, expansion, war, poverty, endurance, and memory. Not bad for meal, water, and fire. But the next transformation would not come from a battlefield. It would come from mills, factories, chemistry, packaging, and the quiet industrialization of the American pantry after the Civil War. Cornbread remains close to the hearth, but the hearth itself begins to change. The old world of hand grinding, local mills, open fires, brick ovens, Dutch ovens, and inherited household judgment does not vanish overnight. Nothing in food history vanishes that cleanly, but during the late 19th century and early 20th century, American cooking moves through a quiet revolution of iron, steel, chemistry, railroads, advertising, packaging, and factory standardization. The bread that once depended on a sack of local meal and the cook's practiced hand begins to pass through machines before it ever reaches the kitchen. This is where cornbread becomes modern, not all at once, gradually, unevenly, region by region, kitchen by kitchen. Start with milling. Because milling shapes everything for much of early American history. Cornmeal was often ground locally, sometimes at small water-powered or animal-powered mills, sometimes at home with mortars, stones, or hand mills. Fresh stone ground meal had flavor, texture, and oil from the germ. It could taste sweet, earthy, and alive in a way that modern shelf-stable meal often does not. But it also spoiled more quickly because the natural oils could go rancid. Local meal was flavorful, but it was not always convenient for a national market. Industrial food hates uncertainty. It wants uniformity, shelf life, transport, predictability, and scale. As roller milling and more centralized grain processing expanded, cornmeal became more standardized. The germ could be removed to extend shelf life. Texture could be controlled. Bags could be shipped farther. Brands could build trust with shoppers who no longer personally knew the miller. A household that once judged meal by local reputation could now buy a printed package with a company name, a logo, and instructions that promised the same result every time. That sounds simple. It was a massive cultural shift. A recipe that once lived in the hand began to live on the box. Think about that for a second. For centuries, a cook knew cornbread through feel, how wet the batter should be, how hot the skillet should sound, how much fat was enough, whether the meal was fresh, coarse, fine, white, yellow, old, or newly ground. Industrial packaging began replacing that sensory world with standardized directions. 1 cup of this, 1 cup of that. Bake at this temperature. Serve warm. The knowledge did not disappear, but it now had competition, printed certainty. Then came chemical leavening. Before modern baking powder, cooks used many methods to lighten breads, cakes, and batters, including yeast, beaten eggs, sour milk, pearlash, saleratus, and other alkaline ingredients. These could work, but they required knowledge, balance, and sometimes luck. Chemical leaveners changed home baking because they made rising easier, faster, and more predictable. Baking soda reacts with acid. Baking powder, especially later double-acting forms, brought acid and alkali together in a controlled product, releasing gas when mixed and heated. For cornbread, this mattered enormously. Cornmeal has no gluten structure like wheat flour. It does not rise into a lofty yeast bread by itself. Add eggs, milk, wheat flour, baking soda, or baking powder, and suddenly the dense survival cake can become lighter, softer, more tender, more cake-like. Not always better, depending on whom you ask, but undeniably different. This was not just cooking, it was chemistry entering the pantry. By the late 19th century, commercial baking powder companies were advertising heavily to American households. They sold not only a product but a promised reliability. Your biscuits would rise, your cakes would be lighter, your quick breads would not depend on a long fermentation or a perfectly judged chemical balance. For busy cooks, especially women managing households under demanding conditions, that promise had power. Convenience is not trivial when labour is relentless. Here is the part nostalgia often misses. Handmade food is beautiful, but handmaking everything is exhausting: grinding, sifting, hauling water, tending fires, managing fuel, raising children, washing clothes, preserving food, tending gardens, cooking multiple meals, and doing it all without modern appliances was not a lifestyle aesthetic. It was work. If a packaged leavener, a cast iron stove, a better mill, or a printed mix saved time, many households had good reason to welcome it. Romance belongs to the person eating, labour belongs to the person cooking. Cast iron also helped reshape cornbread. Iron cookware had been used for generations, but industrial production made skillets, pans, and stoves more widely available and more consistent. A cast iron skillet became nearly synonymous with certain cornbread traditions because it held heat so well. When greased and heated before batter was poured in, it created a crisp crust that many cooks treated as non-negotiable. The skillet was not just a container, it was a flavour machine. Hot iron, hot fat, corn batter, that hiss again. By the 20th century, gas and electric ovens began changing the cooking environment for many households, though access varied sharply by region, race, and class. Open hearth cooking had required managing coals and fire. Wood and coal stoves required another kind of skill. Modern ovens offered controlled heat, or at least something closer to controlled heat. Cornbread could now be baked in standard pans, timed by clock rather than only by smell and instinct. Again, not instant transformation. Rural homes, poor homes, and isolated homes often adopted new technologies later, but the direction was clear. Fire was being enclosed, regulated, and sold back as convenience. Then came packaged mixes. In the early 20th century, companies increasingly sold prepared or semi-prepared foods to American consumers. Cake mixes, pancake mixes, biscuit mixes, and cornbread mixes promised speed, consistency, and ease. Jiffy Corn Muffin Mix, introduced in the 20th century by the Chelsea Milling Company in Michigan, became one of the most famous examples. Small box, low price, sweet, soft result, for many Americans. That little blue and white box became more familiar than a sack of stone-ground meal. And here is where the cultural argument sharpens again. For some cooks, packaged mix represented convenience, affordability, and reliability. It helped busy families put something warm on the table. It made cornbread accessible to people who did not inherit a recipe or own a heavy skillet. It reduced effort. It worked for others. It represented loss. Loss of texture, loss of fresh meal flavor, loss of regional identity, loss of the unsweetened skillet bread they considered real cornbread, loss of the old relationship between grain, hand, and fire. A boxed mix could taste like childhood to one person and like betrayal to another. Food memory is unreasonable that way, which is exactly why it is powerful. The industrial age also changed the grain itself, hybrid corn varieties, agricultural science, mechanization, synthetic fertilizers, and later massive commodity systems increased production dramatically. Corn became not only a food crop but an industrial raw material. It fed livestock. It became starch, oil, syrup, alcohol, and eventually fuel. The corn and cornbread became just one small branch of an enormous corn economy. That is the strange modern reversal. Cornbread began as a food made from one of the world's most important grains. Then corn became so industrially important that the bread almost seems like a memory of what the crop used to mean. Human food, hearth food, survival food, something you could hold. Meanwhile, the texture of everyday cornbread kept changing. Degerminated meal had longer shelf life but less flavor than fresh stone-ground meal. Baking powder made breads rise higher. Wheat flour made them softer. Sugar made them sweeter. Factory mixes made them more uniform. Refrigeration changed dairy access. National magazines and cookbooks spread recipes across regions. Radio, television. And later the internet turned private kitchen arguments into public identity debates. Should it be sweet? Should it be plain? Should it be crumbly? Should it be tender? Industrialization did not end tradition. It multiplied versions of it. By the mid-20th century, cornbread could appear as a rural staple, a cafeteria square, a soul food essential, a barbecue side, a Thanksgiving dressing ingredient, a supermarket mix, a restaurant muffin, or a symbol of old-fashioned home cooking. It could be made from heirloom stone-ground meal or from a box that cost less than a cup of coffee. Sacred to some, disposable to others. The bread survived by changing, and that is the quiet genius of cornbread again. It adapts. It adapted from teosinte to maize. It adapted from indigenous hearths to colonial kitchens. It adapted from ash cakes to skillets. It adapted from ration food to regional pride. It adapted from hand-ground meal to industrial mixes. Each transformation gave something. Each transformation took something away. The next chapter shows what happens when one crucial piece of older maize knowledge is forgotten. And the cost is measured not in flavor, but in disease. Now the story turns toward a disease that should make the whole history of cornbread feel different. Not because corn was poisonous, not because cornbread itself was evil, because a crucial piece of knowledge was lost, ignored, or separated from the grain as it moved through poverty, industry, and racial inequality in the American South. The disease was pellagra. For many Americans today, pellagra is almost forgotten. It sounds old, like something from a medical textbook with yellowed pages, but in the early 20th century, it became a public health crisis across the southern United States. People developed the classic symptoms sometimes described as the 3Ds dermatitis, diarrhea, and dementia. In severe cases, there was a fourth D, death. The skin could become rough, darkened, cracked, and painfully inflamed, especially where sunlight hit it. The digestive system could fail. The mind could change. People became weak, confused, anxious, depressed, or delusional. Families watched relatives decline without understanding why. Doctors argued, newspapers speculated, institutions filled, poverty deepened, and all around them, in kitchens, mills, tenant farms, orphanages, prisons, and textile towns, there was cornmeal. That detail led many observers in dangerous directions. Some thought pellagra came from spoiled corn, some blamed germs, some blamed poor hygiene, some blamed heredity, some blamed moral weakness, because societies often prefer blaming the poor to feeding them properly. In the South, where racial segregation, tenant farming, low wages, and political neglect shape daily life, pellagra spread most fiercely among people whose diets were monotonous and deficient poor white families, black families trapped by sharecropping and discrimination, mill workers, prisoners, and patients in institutions. This was not a mysterious curse. It was malnutrition. But it took years of bitter dispute before that became widely accepted. Here is the missing key. Niacin, also called vitamin B3, is essential for human health. Maize contains niacin, but in untreated corn it's not sufficiently available to the body. Traditional indigenous alkaline processing. The soaking or cooking of maize with lime or ash helps release that niacin. It also improves the grain in other ways. That knowledge was embedded in Mesoamerican food systems for centuries. It was not a minor detail. It was nutritional architecture. When maize travelled into many European and American foodways, that architecture was often abandoned. People kept the crop. They lost the process. Think about that for a second. A food system that had worked for thousands of years depended not only on the plant, but on the method. Remove the method, narrow the diet, add poverty, and the result could become deadly. Cornmeal could fill the stomach while the body starved for a missing nutrient, full but deficient, eating but weakening, fed but not nourished. That is one of the cruelest kinds of hunger. In the early 20th century South, many poor families lived on diets heavy in cornmeal, molasses, fatback, and little else. Fresh meat, milk, eggs, vegetables, and diverse foods could be scarce or unaffordable. Sharecroppers often depended on credit systems that kept them in debt. Textile mill workers bought cheap food because wages were low. Prisons and institutions served monotonous meals because poor people under state control were rarely treated as lives worth investing in. Pellagra thrived in that world. The scale was staggering. By the early decades of the 20th century, millions of cases were reported in the United States, and tens of thousands of deaths occurred over time. Some estimates suggest that between the early 1900s and the mid-20th century, pellagra affected roughly 3 million Americans and killed more than 100,000. More than 100,000! This was not an obscure footnote. This was a nutritional disaster unfolding in plain sight. One of the central figures in solving it was Dr. Joseph Goldberger, a physician with the United States Public Health Service, beginning in the 1910s. Goldberger investigated pellagra in southern institutions and communities. He noticed something important. Staff members at institutions did not get pellagra at the same rates as patients, even when they lived near them, if the disease were infectious in the simple sense many believed. That pattern made little sense. Diet, however, explained it. Patients ate poorer food, staff ate better food. Goldberger pushed the argument that pellagra was caused by dietary deficiency. To prove it, he studied orphanages, prisons, and hospitals, improving diets and watching pellagra rates fall. He and his colleagues also conducted deeply troubling experiments by today's ethical standards, including attempts to show pellagra was not contagious through what were called filth parties, where volunteers were exposed to bodily materials from pellagra patients. The experiments did not transmit the disease. The name alone is enough to ruin dinner, which is fair, because the history of public health is not always appetizing. But the conclusion mattered. Pellagra was not spreading like a simple infection. It was being produced by bad diets. And that finding ran into resistance because it accused the social order. If pellagra was caused by diet, then poverty, wages, tenancy, institutional neglect, and food access were implicated. That was politically uncomfortable. It was easier to blame a germ. It was easier to blame corn. It was easier to blame the victims. It was much harder to say that an entire regional economy was feeding people so poorly that they became sick. This is the part that should make you angry. The cure was not exotic. Better diets helped milk, eggs, meat, beans, fresh vegetables, yeast, and later niacin enrichment. The solution required not only medical knowledge but social willingness. Feed people properly, pay them enough, stop trapping them in systems where the cheapest calories replaced adequate nutrition. But societies often delay simple solutions when the people suffering are poor. Cornbread sat at the centre of this crisis in a strange way. It was blamed, defended, eaten, reworked, and misunderstood. Corn-based diets were associated with pellagra. But the deeper problem was untreated corn combined with dietary monotony and poverty. Traditional nixtamalized maize foods in Mesoamerica did not produce the same pattern, because the processing and broader food systems differed. The lesson was not that corn was dangerous. The lesson was that food knowledge is part of food. A grain is not enough. A recipe is not enough. A diet is not enough if it is built from deprivation. Eventually, the identification of niacin and the introduction of enriched grain products helped reduce pellagra dramatically in the United States. In the 1940s, enrichment of flour and meal with key vitamins became more widespread, and the disease declined sharply. Medical science finally put a name and chemical explanation to something older food traditions had already prevented through practice. That should humble anyone who thinks modern knowledge always replaces traditional knowledge neatly. Sometimes modern science explains why traditional practice worked. Sometimes it arrives late. For Cornbread, pellagra left a shadow. It revealed how a survival bread could become part of a poverty trap when stripped of nutritional context. It showed how industrial meal, racial inequality, poor diets, and economic exploitation could turn cheapness from virtue into danger. It also showed that the history of a humble food can lead straight into public health, labour systems, and political neglect. Cornbread had kept early America alive. But in some places, under some conditions, dependence on untreated cornmeal helped expose how badly America failed its poorest people. That is the hard lesson here. Not that cornbread was false comfort, not that corn was the villain, but that survival food can only do so much when society decides survival is enough. And now, after disease, war, slavery, removal, industry, and poverty, the story finally returns to the modern table, where a square of cornbread looks simple again. It is not. And now you return to the modern kitchen, where cornbread looks almost too simple to carry everything it carries. Maybe it sits in a cast-iron skillet cut into wedges with crisp brown edges and a tender yellow centre. Maybe it comes from a square pan at a church supper. Maybe it arrives beside barbecue, chili, collard greens, fried catfish, beans, or a bowl of stew. Maybe it comes from a blue and white box, mixed in 3 minutes, baked, while the rest of dinner comes together. Maybe it is sweet enough to feel like cake. Maybe it is unsweetened, crumbly, and stern, as if it has opinions about your character. Cornbread is still ordinary. That is its disguise. Because the grain behind it is no longer merely a household staple. Corn is one of the largest crops on Earth. Recent USDA global data places world corn production at roughly 1.3 billion metric tons for the 2024 to 2025 marketing year, with the United States, China, Brazil, Argentina, and Ukraine among the major producers. 1.3 billion metric tons. Think about that for a second. A wild grass from southern Mexico became a global agricultural giant. And most of that corn does not become cornbread. That is the curveball in the modern United States. Corn flows into animal feed, ethanol, starches, sweeteners, oils, industrial alcohol, beverage alcohol, and processed foods. USDA's Economic Research Service notes that wet millers turn corn into high fructose corn syrup, glucose, dextrose, starch, corn oil, industrial alcohol, and fuel ethanol. While the United States remains the world's largest corn exporter, this was not the future an ancient farmer could have imagined. Not tortillas alone, not porridge alone, not ash cakes, pone, Johnny cakes, hoe cakes, Dodgers, or skillet bread alone. Corn is now in livestock barns, fuel tanks, snack aisles, soda factories, paper coatings, adhesives, bioplastics, pharmaceuticals, an ingredient list so long they feel less like food than paperwork. The crop became invisible by becoming everywhere. That is the strange fate of many commodities. When something becomes rare, people notice it. When it becomes universal, people stop seeing it. Cornbread does the opposite. It remains visible, almost old-fashioned. A reminder that this enormous industrial crop once mattered most because it could be ground, mixed with water, and cooked near fire. In modern America, cornbread also becomes memory food. It appears in soul food restaurants and black family kitchens, where it often sits beside greens, beans, pot liquor, fried fish, or slow-cooked meats, carrying histories of skill, survival, migration, church gatherings, and Sunday tables. It appears in southern kitchens where the skillet is treated almost like an heirloom document. It appears in Appalachian foodways, native food traditions, Midwestern suppers, New England Johnny cake revivals, and Thanksgiving dressing debates that can become surprisingly intense for something made of meal. That argument over sugar still survives. Some people say sugar makes it cake. Some people say a little sweetness is tradition. Some people say white cornmeal is proper. Others use yellow. Some demand buttermilk. Some swear by hot water cornbread. Some want cracklings. Some want honey. Some want the exact version their grandmother made, which is understandable but historically dangerous, because grandmothers are powerful witnesses and unreliable national archives. A little dry humour is allowed here. Cornbread can turn a family table into a constitutional convention. But beneath the jokes, the arguments matter because they show how deeply food binds people to place. Cornbread is not just texture, it is inheritance. It is what you ate when money was tight. It is what sat beside the beans. It is what your mother cut from the pan. It is what your father crumbled into milk. It is what showed up at funerals, reunions, church basements, barbecue joints, school cafeterias, and late suppers after long work days. The old survival function has not disappeared. It has become emotion, and globally, maize continues to feed billions indirectly and directly, from tortillas in Mexico and arepas in Colombia and Venezuela, to ugali in East Africa, polenta in Italy, sadza in Zimbabwe, pap in southern Africa, corn porridges, steamed cakes, fermented drinks, and street foods across continents. Cornbread is only one branch of a much larger maize family, but it is the branch that tells the early American story with unusual clarity. It tells you who learned from whom. It tells you who survived winter. It tells you who controlled rations. It tells you who worked the fields. It tells you what poverty tasted like. It tells you what memory kept. Cornbread was there when indigenous cultivators transformed teosinte into maize. It was there when Mesoamerican civilizations made maize sacred. It was there when cooks used ash and lime to unlock nutrition long before vitamins had names. It was there when the crop travelled north through trade, migration, ceremony, and need. It was there when Europeans arrived, confused, hungry, and dependent on knowledge they did not respect. It was there in colonial cabins, it was there in soldiers' camps, it was there in plantation quarters, it was there on frontier roads, it was there during removal, expansion, slavery, civil war, industrialization, and poverty. It was there when Pellagra exposed the cost of forgetting older food knowledge. It was there when factories boxed convenience and sold it back to the kitchen. And it is still there now, quiet on a plate, looking harmless. You pick up a piece and it breaks slightly in your hand. The crumb is warm, the edge is crisp, the smell is toasted corn, fat, heat, and memory. It does not announce 9,000 years of agriculture. It does not mention Valley Forge, Jamestown, Plymouth, the Popol Vuh, plantation ration lines, the Trail of Tears, Civil War hunger, industrial mills, or public health disasters. It just sits there. But history often works that way. The things closest to us are the easiest to underestimate. So the next time cornbread appears beside your meal, try to see it clearly, not as a side dish, not merely as comfort food, not as a sweet or unsweet argument waiting to happen. See it as a survival technology, a colonial dependency, a ration, a regional badge, a family memory, and a small edible monument to one of the most consequential crops human beings ever shaped. Cornbread is never just cornbread. It never was. And if this story surprised you, do me a favour and hit subscribe, like the video, and comment with the part of cornbread's history you did not expect. There are more everyday foods with histories this strange, this dark, and this human, and I will see you in the next one.